Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and we're here in our second week on this series about sacrifice. And so if you're still with us, we're impressed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, exactly. And we decided that we would talk about the second week from our Studio C, is what we're now calling it, also known as Lee Town's office. So again, Lee, I sent you a text. Hopefully you got it. But nonetheless, yeah.
So if you were with us last week, we both in the Sunday message and then a podcast afterwards, we were talking primarily about sacrifice in the area of resources.
Yeah.
And not only the reality that God calls us to sacrifice, but so often there are things that get in the way, not of us knowing whether or not we should, but in some cases wondering how, and more importantly, wondering if we're actually going to be safe, if we're going to be taken care of, if we can trust God both with our own good and with the good of whatever it is that we're sacrificing.
Yeah.
And then this Sunday, we're talking more about sacrifice in the area of time.
Yeah, and I think depending upon your wiring, or maybe even your place in life, for example, time may actually be something that is more challenging to deal with than maybe our resources. I think again, this idea of sacrifice, it means, it's doing something that from a logical standpoint without God doesn't make sense. So, even if you have a lot of resources, it still doesn't mean you can't sacrifice. But I think so many of us, if we look at our Outlook calendars, even before we shot this podcast, you looked at me and said, when's your hard stop? Because, there's something else to be done and, there's something else for you to do. And these are all, I'm going to assume most of the time, good things.
Yeah.
I think the tension a lot of times comes in is when God steps in, or do we even ask him to step in and say, God, is my agenda your agenda? Right? And even though the term "my" belies a statement that I have an agenda.
Yeah. And
going back to what we talked about last week, and I reinforced at the beginning of this talk, that these principles in the week one apply across the board. And one is that I don't belong to me, you don't belong to you. We have been bought with a price, as it says in the Bible. And so that I actually don't have an agenda. Really, I don't. It's his agenda, and my job is to say, God, what would you have me do today?
Yeah.
And there's a balance between planning and using the spirit of wisdom that God tells us about in Ephesians chapter 2, but also it can often be one of these moments, and we'll talk about it some more today as we talked about on Sunday. This is where we just go about sort of doing what we do and the way that we do it, and we don't ever invite God into the process.
Yeah.
At least not continually. Sometimes we invite God in the process up front, and that turns out to be like if you have someone in your life that, when you first meet them, especially if you get married, you say, oh, I love you, right? And well, I said that 10 years ago, why do I need to repeat it? Well, there's a lot of reasons we need to repeat it. And there's a lot of reasons that we need to make sure that we're constantly interacting with God, especially on this concept of sacrifice and when it comes to time.
Yeah. And so if you caught the Sunday message, which is always the encouragement, you probably noticed that there were a lot of how-tos. That there was a lot of the kinds of things that we would often cover here. It's sort of the practical application that you got in the Sunday message. And so, as always, but even more so this time, very strongly encourage you to make sure that you caught the Sunday message either before this or immediately after this, because the context is going to be really helpful. In part because there's not as much how-to that we need to address here. And so we're going to go into a sort of a second layer of how-to, the thing behind the thing. But is there anything that you want to catch people up on if they're catching this first?
Sure. If they're catching this first, I laid out 4 hows, right? Because it's one thing to say this is what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to be sacrificial and generous. But many times if we don't understand how to do that, then what we wind up doing is we wind up wasting the very thing we don't want to waste, and that's time. Because at no point do we actually waste time when we're doing what God wants.
Right.
But there are times that we actually wind up wasting time when we're doing what we think God wants, but we don't invite him into the process.
Yeah.
So as we say all the time on this podcast, Faith Forward, we say ask God. And that really is the first how-to. Ask before do. And for a lot of us who are to-do list people, that's a challenge. That ask may look like be a moment in your day, or maybe just starting out or ending your day with, God, what do you want me to do tomorrow? Or what do you want me to do next week? Or what do you want me to do today? And I found for me, it's helpful to actually make some time in the morning before I go about what's on my schedule to say, God, how is this supposed to work out today? Do you want to change anything? And a lot of those. The second one is don't typecast. I think we oftentimes see other people, even if they're doing the same job, and we begin, this is to think how we're supposed to do things. But Ephesians says we're uniquely and wonderfully made, even for doing the same job. And God has created good works for us to do before the foundation of the earth. And those are unique to me that don't apply to John. And we both work at a church. They're unique to you that don't apply to us. And so don't typecast based upon other people, or don't typecast as well based upon we've done it that way before, so this is how God wants to do us again.
So I don't need to ask.
Right, I don't need to ask. You know, I didn't even get into this when I talked about it on Sunday, but a good example of that would have been taking the promised land. Joshua had to ask, had to know how around Jericho. Then he just basically typecast what happened next at Ai, and it didn't work out so well. If you don't know the story, look it up. It doesn't work out so well. And so don't typecast. 3, live in the now and prepare for the eternal. I really want to say that God's not asked us not to live in the reality of now, but what we do in the now has to be also an eternal, or another way to say it, a kingdom perspective. And then the last one was just be this. It's a little bit going to what I talked about last week, but I feel like it's something we need to go back all the time with, is just sort of remember and trust that sacrifice does not mean shortage, even with time. Because I had moments just in preparing for this message where a lot of you who know me, or I've talked about it on Sunday, or I've talked about it here, that Tuesday is my very largest study day, right? I don't get everything done on Tuesday, but I have to get the most done on Tuesday, just the way, in general, my life works. It was really interesting this week, as God was trying to teach me the sacrifice doesn't mean shortage, that I felt like he brought all kinds of things into my life that were stressing my study time. Right? Was stressing this idea like, well, I'm supposed to teach about trusting God with my time, but I only have so much time to learn about teaching to these people. And it's just like God to stretch us in those things we're trying to teach, for sure. And so just know he created the world. He's spoken into existence. He's outside of time. If he's asking you in our minds to sacrifice some time that we had aligned in our own minds towards something else, we will not be short, because he's always about giving good gifts, whether it's in resources or even in our time. And so we talked about, though, this idea about, when we go back to Ephesians, he says, live as wise, not as unwise. And one of the things that I said is one of the great delineations of wisdom or not wisdom is how we're using our time. It says redeeming the time if you have a particular King James version. And that's actually a better translation than making the most of every opportunity, because there is a buying up moment. And so as we talk even more about this, and why we're talking about the importance to ask God about each moment is, as I said on Sunday, is when it talks about time or opportunity, that word there is a different word than what we might expect. In the Greek, there are 2 words mostly for time. One is chronos, which is just regular time that happens in a timeline. And then there's one is kairos. And that's a very unique intersection, opportunity, unique thing that God brings into our life. That's the word he's using here. So when he's talking about redeeming an opportunity or redeeming a time, it's like, in every unique moment I bring, make the most of it. And are we willing to do it? How do we do that? Because again, going back to what we just said up front, and I've talked a lot here, it's one thing to say what, it's another thing to do the how. So those were the 4 basic hows. But I love how the fact we're going to even go sort of a layer deeper on this. Because sometimes, even when we know the hows, there are things inside of us that God needs to change and transform before we can even do that.
Yeah, so the podcast today is going to be a little bit more of a meta conversation, a level above the level that we usually talk at. And so if we usually talk about what the thing is and how to do it, today we're going to talk about how do we think about the thing that we know we need to do, and how do we do it. Because one of the things that we know, and if you've ever had a conversation with somebody that seemed to be constantly going sideways, where you're saying one thing and they're saying another, and they're not lining up, they're not connecting. Sometimes it's really helpful to pause and have a conversation about how you're having a conversation, right? When I say this, it feels like what is being heard is that what's happening here, right? You're no longer talking about the topic, you're talking about the conversation that you're having, right? And so sometimes we have to move up a level or two. It's also very much the way that Jesus taught, right? The Sermon on the Mount. He really starts to mess with the way that people think, because so often people came to Jesus looking for content. They came to Jesus thinking, all right, he's going to tell me what to do. He's going to tell me what's right. He's going to tell me what's wrong. And then I can go do that. Right? And he starts saying things like, you have heard it said. People are like, we have heard that, right? We have heard that it's bad to murder and it's bad to commit adultery. And then he starts talking about the way that they think.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least that's his target. Some people here, you have heard it said that you should not murder, but if you even have anger towards your brother in your heart, you've already killed him in your heart. And they're like, all right, so for people that are accessing him at a content level, they're like, all right, so I'm not supposed to murder and I'm not supposed to be angry. Check. What else am I supposed to do, Jesus? And he's like, we're not talking about that.
Yeah.
We're talking about this.
Right.
We're talking about the way that you see people in the world around you.
And if you're hearing this, and this even seems a little like, well, that seems mushy, I don't know how to concrete that. The way that I often like to illustrate that very point is something maybe you've heard me say here, I know I've heard it say from the pulpit, I can't remember saying it here, is when we were kids and we used to be in math class. And the teacher was very much interested, not in the answer that we got. And I had this happen a bunch of times, where it's like, you got to show your work. I'm like, well, why? I got the right answer. And her point was, I want to make sure the way you're reasoning and thinking guarantees you get the right result. Mm-hmm. And so what happens many times in our lives is when we're just looking for the box to check, just what to do, I would use the term we stumble into living rightly, but we don't have the way of thinking in the renewed or transformed mind that God is after that will produce consistent right actions. And so, again, you mentioned this, Proverbs 23 verse 7, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Yeah. Another way to say it, as we begin to think and understand and allow the transformation of Jesus Christ to happen in our lives, the Romans chapter 12, renewed minds, think properly, then these actions come from there. And a lot of the times, as we just said, we're struggle with actions because we aren't thinking properly, allowing you to. Or as a friend of ours says, probably more a friend of yours than mine, but nonetheless, we need to think differently to say that, yeah.
Yeah, we do. And so that's part of what we want to talk about today. And so one of the things that you mentioned in the Sunday message is that we need to ask before doing. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we hear that as, all right, so I need to ask God how to do something that I've already recognized needs to be done. And so one of the first helpful things that we can do is back up a step in where we invite God into the process.
Right.
Is not only identifying solutions and outcomes, but identifying problems in the first place. And I think, for each of us, we'll struggle with one or both of those. Some people may struggle more with, God, I don't know what the issue is, but once you show it to me, I got it. You can sit down now. I won't trouble you. But for others, it's, I know what the problem is. I don't even need to ask you. You just tell me how to solve this.
Yeah.
And the tension is that both encourage us to start relying on our own wisdom.
Yeah, and so we need to be people who are asking God not only the what, but also the how in both of them. And for me, if I was going to fall off the edge one way or the other, more consistently, I fall off the edge of the how. Mm-hmm. I fall off the edge of the what as well, but if I'm just picking, probably more so the how. And going back to this idea of, as the man thinks his heart, so is he. What have I been thinking then at a heart level that allows me to fall off that edge? In one of the lies that I fall susceptible to more often than I should, to say the least, less than I used to, but still more often than I should, is that it's my job to fix it. So this is what happens. I go to God, he tells me the what, thank you. Now it's all on me. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's all on me. I've got to make this happen. I've got to fix this problem. I've got to do this. That ties back into performance. It ties back into all kinds of stuff. But that is one of the lies that I'm believing at a heart level. When I don't consistently go to God with a how, it's in general not necessarily because I'm being overtly prideful, even though I am being prideful, but I don't think of it that way. Yeah. It is because I think, oh, all right, well, he said go do this, and I've got to figure out how to do it. But God is a God who wants to be with us in the how, because the how is a process of transformation, just like the what is a process of transformation.
Yeah. And I think I often fall off more frequently on the what side, where I feel like, the gap between discernment and judgment is razor thin sometimes, right? And I feel like, no, I have a clear discernment of what the problem is. God, let's talk about solutions. And so often, it's felt very quiet.
Can I pause you just for a moment? Yeah. You just said something, what I find to be pretty profound. I don't know if people caught that may not have picked up a little bit of what you just said. You identified a difference between discernment and judgment. You said the gap is razor thin. And some people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Could you flesh it out just for a second before we move on? Because I thought that was really good.
Sure. The way that I use those two words is with the definition of the difference between being wise and unwise, as you were talking about, is whether or not we know what God thinks in that moment. Right? Discernment is when God shows us what is true and what is real. And judgment is when I impose my understanding of what is true and what is real through the lenses and filters that I've accumulated over the course of my life.
Yeah.
And so often people that feel like they have discernment or, a discerning mind or the gift of discernment are really just judgmental. And that's not said critically, it's just the reality that the gap is that narrow between I think I know what's right and God showing me what's right. And so often, I'm a smart guy, I'm well-read, I'm educated, I've lived a few decades now, I feel like I know what the problem is. And so God, how are we going to solve this? And I feel like I get to it a little bit quicker now these days, but when it's quiet, I've realized I've misidentified the problem, and I need to go back to the first step of, God, what is the problem? I felt like it was this or this underlying cause, or, like the doctor is diagnosing a condition and the medication's not treating it, right? The wisdom applied to the identified problem was good. It's just the wrong problem. And if we go back and can get a correct diagnosis, suddenly a new solution presents itself that solves the problem.
Well, thanks. I know that was a little bit of a detour, but I thought it was really profound, and I love the way that you said it. And because we've known each other for a while, I got it exactly. But there could be some people like, well, sure, how's there any difference? So, all right, back to our regularly scheduled podcast.
So that's helpful step number one, is as we're asking before doing and not typecasting, the recognition that God is often going to have a unique solution even to a recurring problem, and that oftentimes God sees the problem differently than we do. The invitation is just to be frequently asking, and it's not because God thinks that we're a moron or an idiot or can't do anything on our own, can't even tie our own shoes. It's the recognition that we have filters and we have lenses through which we see that life has shown us to be true, right? You talked about, I feel like the how is, it's up to me, right? Because so often in life, that seemed to be either the successful pathway out of the problem,
right,
or just the unavoidable solution.
And I love how you use the term seem to be the successful, because I think there's a lot of us, myself included, that for a long time seem to have success, right? And the old statement, it works till it doesn't. And then all of a sudden you hit up against an emotional wall or relational wall or a vocational wall or spiritual wall, pick any of the walls. And you're like, well, I haven't been doing anything differently than I've ever done before. Well, exactly. That was part of the issue that maybe didn't come out until much later.
Yeah. Because so much, very broadly, what we're talking about, again, raise the conversation. When we're talking about sacrifice, whether it's sacrificing our time or sacrificing our resources, we're not actually as much talking about the who we're supposed to sacrifice for, or the when we're supposed to sacrifice our time, or the how much we're supposed to sacrifice our resources. What's really a level or two above is the question of trust. How much do we trust God to lead us, guide us, and provide for the things that he's asking us to do? And so often what we run into is those spiritual walls, the emotional walls, the mental walls, the relational walls, or simply my experience of reality creating a wall that says, I can't go past this, and I bet you that God can't either. And we never say that theologically. We would never say that because we know that he's the God who's able to do abundantly more than all we could ask or imagine, right? We know the right answer. You step into church, the right answer is Jesus. Jesus can do whatever he wants. But there's, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. There's a heart level reality that life has shown us that says, I don't think God could do this. And that's part of what we have to be more attentive to in our asking, is even before we sometimes ask the what, identify the problem, or ask the how, identify the solution, is to get to that heart level place of, God, do I actually trust you here?
And do you think that uniquely shows up, and maybe that's not the best way to frame it. You made the statement, being sacrificial with our resources. You're like, I didn't remember John making the statement. It's written down, okay? Being sacrifices with our resources might, and you underline that, might, usually rarely does. But let's just say there's this small percentage of time that being sacrificial with our resources might allow us to avoid people.
Right.
But there is no way that we really can avoid people with being sacrificial with our time. And then that begins to rub up when we go to God and we ask God, not the what, and not just the what, but also the how, about how he wants to be sacrificial with my time, begins to rub up that a lot of times there's hurt in our story. Around people. Maybe it's people in general, maybe it's specific people, whatever it might be. What do we begin to do? How do we process that? Especially because there are people in our lives, I think, that have intentionally hurt us. And people, all of us can go through a list of people. Some of those intentional hurts, if we're going from an earthly scale, massively outweigh others of them, right? And we never want to say that wasn't real. Hurt is hurt. Pain is pain. It's real. And especially it's difficult and challenging when it's been done intentionally. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that pain isn't real and doesn't hurt when it seems like it's been done unintentionally. Yeah. I think we've all been in scenarios around people where we wind up getting hurt. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that people, set out and said, hey, my agenda for today, because it couldn't be God's agenda, right? My agenda then would be intentionally hurt people. Yeah. But it happens, right? Yeah. And so now God calls us into being sacrificial with our time. And that sort of creates some tension, right? About what we have to do and move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, because if we're going to sacrifice with people and for people, it means we have to engage with people. And for many of us, that's just, like you said, that's a sensitive spot from time immemorial. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we have to remember is that anything that God is for, Satan is against. Mm-hmm. And God is so clearly relational, and he so clearly intends for us to be relational. And so that's why we said, you might be able to sacrifice your resources and be able to avoid the messiness and the friction and the pain of people. Just cut a check and solve a problem. And that's not to diminish the value of giving financially, but it's the reality that's not the fullness of what God is inviting us into a sacrifice, is that he really wants us to be shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, working together to identify problems and solve them. And so that means that we're each then going to have to deal with the effects of what happened to us, the effects of those pain points. Somebody that I have a lot of respect for said it this way, that the only thing worse than what happened to you, the only thing worse than the pain that you endured, either intentionally or unintentionally, sins of omission or sins of commission, things that were done to you or things that weren't done that were supposed to be. The only thing worse than the pain that you experienced at the hands of others from what they did or didn't do is what we did with it. The only thing worse than what happened to us is what we did with it, how we allowed it to interpret reality for us. Yeah. How we allowed it to tell us what we believed was true, what the enemy wanted us to believe was true about ourselves, about others, about God, and about the world around us. And so some of what God is after in this area of sacrifice is not just solving other people's problems. It's not just the distribution or redistribution of resources. It's not just the dedication of time because it's a spiritually beneficial practice and it's helpful for others that are in need. God is after your restoration. The fiery arrows that Ephesians 6 talks about with the armor of God that have been launched at us in an attempt to wound, in an attempt to bring accusation from the father of lies. God doesn't want us to be walking around with those for the rest of our life, just limping along and doing our best. Mm-hmm. Right? Like Jesus said when he picks up the scroll of Isaiah in the temple, he says, I've come to bind up the brokenhearted and set the captives free. And that's us. That's all of us.
And we talked about this last week, and we alluded to it again this week, that God doesn't need anything from us. And so ultimately, while sacrifice does have some benefit for other people, I feel very confident theologically that if I choose not to sacrifice, God isn't going to punish someone else because I chose not to do it. Right. So he's going to take care of it a different way. So ultimately, calling us to be sacrificial generous is really much more about our transformation. Yeah. And one of the interesting things was, when I was thinking about what you'd written down, is how he then uses this moment of sacrificing time to get to some of the other things. So for me personally, I went back and said, I struggle with the what, but I feel like I've got the how. So I got to do it on my own. right? So that's not true. But here's what I discovered. I also discovered that when God calls me in a scenario to be sacrificially generous with my time to someone, that then shows up here, because if I feel like it's my responsibility to fix it, which is not, I am very averse in my flesh to go into a situation that God has called me to that I feel like is hopeless.
Yeah.
That I can't do anything to change.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, I find myself maybe not verbalizing it, because, again, as you said earlier on, we don't ever say things like that, but our actions reveal that.
Yeah.
Thinking it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
Right? And it's never a waste of time if Jesus asked. He's not about doing that. But you see how the thought process behind that leads me. If it's my job to fix it, which isn't true, then I look at a situation and I think that's not fixable. Also never true.
Right.
But it's not fixable by me, so it builds on those two lies. Then I begin to think that it's a waste of my time. Lie number 3.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Even though God might call me to do it. And in fact, there are times I think in my life, now I'm verbalizing this out loud, that I failed to go because I've used the difference between discernment and judgment, right? I've failed to even go in my judgment and ask God if he wants me to do it, because I've built up all of these things to say is not. So I think for you as you're listening, maybe that seems really convoluted or whatever it might be, but just think of those moments or those places, those people in your life. And if you have a natural tendency to say, God would never ask me to do blank.
Yeah.
I'm not saying God would. What I'm asking is whether or not you've asked him.
Yeah. And so often we don't recognize in particular the deeply worn thought ruts that we have. The things that we've seen proven true again and again and again throughout our life, or we've seemed to have seen prove true again and again and again. And so it becomes a place where it feels like I don't need to ask God about this because I already know the answer. That if I give, I'm not going to have enough because I've seen it happen. That if I sacrifice my time in this situation, it's never going to pan out. It's never going to resolve their problem because I've never seen it work, right? And again, those are things that we might not ever think consciously or verbalize, which is why Scripture refers to them as strongholds. That it's, and I love language, and I love looking at what words mean. And the word stronghold in the Greek is a place of plausible alternative, and essentially an alternate reality, something that is not real but seems real. If you're a fan of The Matrix, like that's a great analogy of a stronghold. It seems real and it's just not, and the more real it seems doesn't actually make it any more real. But we just become so locked into a way of thinking and a way of seeing that we don't even recognize it as being one of several options. We just see it as the way that it is. And this is one of the things that God seems to be after, is showing us what's true, right? So often Jesus goes around saying, the kingdom of heaven is like, and he tells a story because he's trying to get people to think differently than he's trying to not give them content. Right? He's trying to give them something more than just the what and the how. He's trying to help them to see reality in a whole new way. And so with this area of sacrifice, one of the things that God is after is helping us to see differently, to see reality differently. That you look at going back to our topic from last week about sacrificing resources. Jesus very famously says to the rich young ruler, who's done all the other whats and hows, Jesus says, all right, so the last thing you need to do is sell everything and come follow me. And the rich young ruler is very sad, and he goes away because he had so much. And Jesus comments to the disciples that it's, just about impossible, essentially, for, someone who's wealthy to enter into the kingdom of heaven. But that's clearly not a universal statement against all wealth, because he has, Joseph of Arimathea, who purchases the tomb where Jesus is put to rest. It's a very wealthy man that Jesus never told sacrifice it all, right? Martha and Mary and Lazarus, that family, they were pretty well off. And Jesus never said, hey, sell everything and keep following.
Yeah.
But then there's also this guy, Judas, who has serious heart level issues with money that Jesus is like, hey, we're going to try to deal with this. I know how this ends, but I'm going to put you in charge of the money, right? He's always after the heart level reality that we believe is true, in order to show us what's actually real.
And so in that case, selling his resources was an illustrative thing to show what's inside, right? Are you willing to sacrifice this and trust and walk in me?
Yeah.
And that applies so many places. That's why sacrifice is counterintuitive, as I talked about last week, because for us, getting rid of those things that make us secure makes us less secure. But if God asks us to do it, we're in no more place of security than we ever will be than when we obey the God of the universe who loves us and cares for us, sent Jesus to die for us. And you know all these things, right? I mean, if you listen to this podcast, you listen to the sermons at any time from anybody who's spoken to Christian Fellowship Church, you know these things. I know these things.
Yeah.
And so, but since he's about transforming us, and going back, that's what all of these rhythms and cadences we've been talking about, the purpose to transform us, the call to sacrifice in any or all of these areas we'll be talking about this in series, our willingness to trust him and engage him and do that really is a revelation of our heart and a transformation then when we choose to do it if it needs to be transformed. But it requires just, I mean, these strongholds, all these things, again, part of what God is about in the sacrifice. And I feel like it's, whatever that part is, it's a high percentage, right? Is our transformation. God is using sacrifice to transform us, which means to help us, right? Because I think all of us would say, I want to be more like Jesus. Yeah. All of us would say, I want the life to the full that Jesus said he came that we could have. Yet, when it comes to this particular cadence and rhythm, when it comes to sacrificing our time, or even what we're talking about in a couple weeks, our temperament, which is a whole different discussion that way, right? And Pastor Mike, our director of youth ministry, he'll be here probably most like talk to you that. But it'll be really interesting when we think about the thing that we're most worried about. Loss requires us to lose something in order to gain the full life, right? It is that sort of tension. It's again, God's ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts, which goes all the way back. It means ask before doing.
Right? Yeah. And put yourself in a place where this becomes about trust, right? Because what a stronghold is essentially is something that we trust in more than God, right? It's either the thing that we turn to for comfort and security and stability, or it's the way of thinking that we turn to. It's all up to me.
Yeah.
Even when we know that God is the God of the universe and he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine, right? There's still that internal sense of trust that when push comes to shove, I trust myself more than God. Yeah. Or I trust in money more than I trust in God. Clearly when Jesus was talking about money, he said that money's not the problem, it's the love of money, right? That, so how much money is too much? It's when you feel like you have enough that you don't have to trust God anymore. Right? How much time do I need to sacrifice? Well, how much free time do you feel like you would need to have so you don't have to trust God with your time?
Yeah. I love when you're talking about, I know we're kind of going back and forth between resources that's physical and time, but that Proverbs chapter 30, if you ever have a moment to read it, you really should, because it's one that I go back to a lot, is the prayer of the author of that proverb is this: God, don't allow me to have too much so I don't live in a way that I don't need you, so that I don't trust you. But then he says, God, don't allow me to have too little so I'm not tempted then to also not trust you in my littleness and go out and want to do something I shouldn't do. Yeah. Right? And we could fall off the edge on either side because it's not about that physical resource. It's not about the time. It is, again, about where we're going to place our trust. Yeah. And God is a God who loves us. I probably haven't said this in a while, but the Romans 8, where he perfectly loves us, unconditionally accepts us, and always protects us, so we neither have to fear nor perform. Do I really believe that God, as I'm his son, right? That he perfectly loves me and unconditionally protects me, right? And he's always doing what's in my best interest. Those are those tensions. And again, going back to sacrifice and invest of time, I think it pulls out a lot. So I feel like I'm wandering all over the place. If you stand with me, thank you.
And this really is why the rhythm of sacrifice, and again, it's a rhythm. It's not a one-off. It's not a box check. The rhythm of sacrifice is one of the most helpful ways for God to get at those deep places of belief in us. It's one of the most helpful ways for him to restore our ability to see reality, the reality of who he is and who we are, that we neither have to fear nor perform, that we are perfectly loved, because some of this has to be experienced, right? You may have done the Bible in a year plan 15 times by this time in your life, and you know what's in there, but there's still some heart level realities that are actually in direct contradiction to what God has revealed in the truth of his written word that we're still living out of. And he doesn't want that for us. And so through sacrifice, through these places where it feels like the only takeaway is discomfort, what he's really after is our restoration. It's not about the thing. It's, at the end of the day, it's not about the time. It's not about the money. And at the end of the day, honestly, and I think I'm on solid footing here, it's not even about the people that we're sacrificing for, to the exclusion of how much this is about us. And this is actually something that God just sort of dropped on me Sunday as I was leaving church. It was one of those rare Sundays where I just got to go to church, which was really kind of a fun experience.
Which doesn't make really a lot of sense for a lot of you, but just to give you context, John leads so many of our ministries here at church. One specifically is our Square One class. Little plug, if you haven't signed up for Square One, we're going to have one coming up on the 20th of April, starting on Wednesday nights, and the beginning of May, starting on Sunday nights, which helps you understand basic beliefs, how you're wired, what God's called you to, and helps you walk in a way that experiences the life that God wants you to live. And so many times he's teaching those classes instead of having the opportunity to hear Mike or myself or Lee or whoever over the time, Chris, that had been speaking. So I thought I'd cover that for you.
No,
was
I
what are you doing?
that.
Right?
So, I got to just sit in the service and listen, and then walk out and get into my car and drive home like everybody else. And so I was just having the conversation with God, and interestingly, it started with where it often starts with me of, God, what am I supposed to do and where am I supposed to go, right?
Yeah.
God, who am I supposed to be sacrificing for? How much am I supposed to be sacrificing? There was a heart level assumption that comes up pretty often of, I'm probably not doing enough. You're probably going to ask me to do more, right? And it was so interesting to watch myself have this conversation with God, the conversation about the conversation. To watch these things come up out of my heart that I still believe on some level that I'm not doing enough and that God's just going to ask me to do more, right? And it was so fascinating to see these things come up and out, and it was like, ugh. All right, let's talk about that. We'll get back to the who and the what and the where and the when, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about these deeper places in me at a heart level, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he, that I'm still operating out of. But I'm not doing enough, and you're only ever going to ask me to do more. And this is what he started to tell me. He said that sacrificing is always about your benefit, even if it's outwardly benefiting someone else. Sacrifice is never to your detriment. And if we think it is, it's revealing where we're not seeing or thinking or feeling the way that he is, which, as we said at the very beginning, is the definition of wisdom or the lack of wisdom. That the difference between those two is whether or not we know what God thinks. And so if I think that sacrifice is only about detriment, I'm not thinking the way that God is. And, I've talked before on this platform about, food is one of my strongholds, frankly. It's the thing that I trust in more than God. When I'm uncomfortable, when I'm stressed, when I'm angry, go to the fridge. And I hate it. I hate that that's still a battle. And it was one of those times where I thought I'd correctly identified the problem. And in the last couple of weeks, I went back to God and I'm like, all right, let's start at the beginning. What's the problem? And the problem was that I really don't think in the moment that he can bring me comfort in the way that I can provide for myself.
Yeah.
And so what he invited me to do, and again, sometimes it sounds counterintuitive, he invited me to fast for a week. Sun up to sundown style fasting, not 7 days of full deprivation, water only, but skip all the meals and snacks other than dinner at the end of the day. And I usually, honestly, I do pretty well with fasting. I don't get hungry a lot. I can I can work through breakfast and lunch and be just fine by dinner. I'm not looking to chew my arm or somebody else's off, which works out really well for relationships.
Yeah, and other people's arms.
Yeah, seriously. But what was so fascinating was, even just within the first couple of days, and again, I didn't do this out of my own wisdom. Right? I didn't decide, all right, I'm going to solve my problem. I'm going to deprive myself of food. I asked God what the problem was and what the solution was. And so as I enter into his solution and start living that out, the first couple of days, I would still feel those pulls towards, man, I'm swamped with work. I got to crank this out. I'm a little stressed. Let me go to the fridge, grab a snack. And I was like, nope, I'm not doing that because I'm fasting. God, could you, I'm not even sure I trust you with it, but could you help me feel comfort in this moment? And he did. And it wasn't like the clouds parted and light shone down or anything, but there was just a deeply settled place in me that was suddenly allowed to come out because I wasn't, covering it over with food from the fridge.
Yeah.
And so what I thought was going to be a week of sacrifice, a week of detriment, a week of suffering, even in the midst of, was suddenly about my benefit, that I was getting far more than I was ever giving up, whether calorically or through food comfort. And so he's going on to say that God's asking me to learn to trust him with any form of resource, that's actually primarily about my benefit at a heart level. Because like we were talking about before, if he only wanted to take care of somebody else, if the goal was only ever to move my resources to them or to take my time to help them with their project, he could whoosh that some way or another, right? He could get somebody to just, cut a check and drop it in the mail anonymously, and there
or
we
as
go,
he does, it just shows up, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, if that's what was needed, he could do that. But because he is fundamentally relational and he's fundamentally interested in our transformation, that sacrifice is not to my detriment. I'm not truly suffering. I'm not actually losing. I'm gaining. And it's not a silver lining kind of gaining. It's not like, well, there was a happy lesson here in the midst of everything I lost. Like, we lost the big game, but look how much we developed character. Like, it's not that. It's I'm gaining. There is a net increase relative to what I am giving up. And so the purpose of sacrifice is to help me see reality the way that God does. That there actually is no scarcity. There actually are no limitations. And that there's no need to be in bondage to my strongholds of self-sufficiency and self-protection.
Yeah.
And that sacrifice is truly the only way to experience abundance. Right? In my not eating, I discovered how full I was.
Mm-hmm.
In my sacrifice, I got to truly experience the reality of the kingdom. And that was so often what Jesus was trying to help people see. Whether it was with things like "you have heard it said," or with stories of the kingdom of heaven is like, and then saying things they didn't quite understand, that they couldn't just go and do, but they had to think differently about. That's so often what sacrifice is about, is helping us to break those strongholds of thought and behavior, those things that we have put our trust in, that we believe are true. And it's sometimes only through sacrifice that those things will come down and we'll be able to see and think differently.
Yeah, it's a good word. I know, as you said up front, and we said a few times, it's been a little different than we normally do. And we're grateful at any time that you send us an email, faithforward@cfcwire.org, to interact, question, whatever it might be. But it strikes me, maybe even today, you might have been listening, if you made it this far, and thought, I have even a little bit more questions or that sort of stuff, especially when we're talking about how you think, right? And what motivates your behavior. Is it obedience to God and his revelation, or is it something else? And a lot of times in our lives it's something else. We would love to talk to you because this topic of sacrifice is exactly what you said. It's counterintuitive, and it's actually not about other people. It's about what God wants to do to transform in us. And when we're able to grasp that and live from that, then the transformation really happens.
Yeah. So thanks for letting us be a part of your journey.
Yeah.
Thanks for being part of ours. He's still Brian. I'm still John. And we'll see you guys next time.